welcome back to the Way Everlasting YouTube channel. My name is Robert. It's great to be with you today, and looking forward to jumping into our study. We've been trying to get here for a few weeks now, if not months, but winding down to the end here. But going to get into the trumpets today, finally. So let's jump right into it. If you want to follow along, you can. You just got to go to the YouTube channel and the link for the video, and then there's a link for the everlastingcovenant.org//revealing the endtime.pdf, and you can download it. So where we left off last week, I had kind of teased you a little bit about the traditional view of Revelation. That traditional view is that in Revelation chapter 1, where John is referring to the things which he has seen, then there are the things which are, which is referring to Revelation chapter 2 and 3, and then the things which will happen hereafter, which is traditionally taught as Revelation chapter 4 to the end. Now, where I'm going to try to drive to today is this thought or this question: where do we get this idea that the final 7-year period is, or the book of Revelation, most of the book of Revelation, at least for that part, is all happening in this final 7-year period? Where does that come from? And is it scriptural? So if we look at and examine, for example, the traditional view, I'll point a few things out to you, right? So we have the pre-tribulation. Most Christian theology doctrine starts at the pre-tribulation. That means that there's a rapture at the beginning of this final 7-year period, which starts the 7-year tribulation. So we have and then following that is the final 7-year period. This is where Christians, and only Christians, leave the earth. Set aside for a minute that the scripture says that Israel is the bride. I don't know how you reconcile those two. We'll study that later, but naturally I'll have to. I don't know if I'll do it as a part of the study, but I may do it as a separate study, like maybe do a mini study on the rapture on this one, and then do a deeper dive study on the rapture in the next one. So just bear with me. Because there's lots of views about the rapture, of course. And then the trumpets begin, right? So the seals and the bowls, what they teach us, are the same as the trumpets. So the seals are not what starts the cataclysmic events. It's the trumpets that start the events. And the seals and bowls, which don't come after the trumpets, the seals and bowls are... The seals are a shorter version of the trumpets, but the same story. And then you have the bowls, which is an even shorter version. They're both kind of like Reader Digest versions, if you will, of the trumpets. So that's what's traditionally taught. Then you have the 3.5 years that is the midpoint of the tribulation, where you have the confirmation of the covenant. That's by the Antichrist, of course, and that's occurring. And this is where there's some deviation in the Christian belief, where you have mid-tribulation believers believe that the rapture doesn't happen at the beginning of the tribulation, in part because they don't necessarily want to be around for the first 3.5 years, but they do want to, I believe, at least from what I've been taught, they do want to participate in an end-time harvest. And so that final 3.5 years is the final push, where there's a massive end-time harvest, where then you have the rapture after the revealing of the Antichrist, right? And then that leads to the final 3.5 years, which is the Great Tribulation. Now, mind you, the Great Tribulation, they're not called that in the original covenant. The Great Tribulation, for example, is the day of Yahweh's wrath, the day of his wrath. So then you have the Great Tribulation beginning. That's the final 3.5 years, and those cataclysmic events. That leads up to the Battle of Armageddon. And then you have another view in Christianity called the post-tribbers. So the post-tribulation belief is that the post-tribulation, because Yeshua said, you won't see me again until you see me and basically meet me in the air. Well, Yeshua never returns in the rapture theology. Yeshua only returns to the earth at the second coming. So the post-tribbers believe that there's scriptural grounds for the post-tribulation to occur at the second coming of Yeshua. And then there is the new heaven and the new earth and then the millennium. And I'll tell you, I was a Christian for a very long time. Now I'm just a follower of the way. But most don't understand what the millennium is. They don't understand the correlation of the millennium to the new heaven and new earth, which leads me into truly an alternate view, which I just consider more of a scriptural view of the end times. And this is what we've been taking you guys through. So we have the first 5 trumpets. And if we teach it in a historical or chronological view, what we'll start to show you today is that some of this has already started to unfold. What does that mean? Does that mean we're in the final 7-year period? Unlikely. Possible, but unlikely. And we can talk about that, but there's the first 5 trumpets. There is then what's considered the Psalm 83 and the Isaiah 17 war. This is where Damascus is destroyed. We've been talking about this. Iran has never directly attacked Israel in its history. It's always done it through proxies, even in the 1948 war with Egypt. But now, since then, Iran has attacked Israel in the same year twice. Directly attacked Israel in the same year twice. So Israel's enemies have amped up the war against Israel, and Israel has gone on the offensive, just like we've been teaching, and they are going to take back the land of Canaan. That includes Syria, parts of Syria, and the surrounding land of Canaan. And the scripture is very clear that as they step their feet on the grounds to take possession, the Father will give it to them. That's why they're winning in this war. So what's happening is you have the Psalm 83 war, the Isaiah 17 war. Ultimately, Damascus is destroyed. That's the next outcome, or one of the next outcomes we're looking for. But that doesn't lead to the end. You then have the Gog-Magog war number 1. That's the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war, which most Christians will believe is the actual Armageddon. And that's not what the scripture teaches either. Then we have the 6th trumpet. Then we have the 7th trumpet and the Net Chetef, or the rapture. Now that means, if you do understand the book of Revelation, the 6th trumpet says that a third part of mankind will die prior to this event. So those are all things that we have to unpack in this study. Are we saying that that's the way it's going to unpack? No, but what we're saying is these are things to consider as we look at this in chronological order, if it's in chronological order. We then see the Antichrist or Anti-Messiah. I don't call him Christ because, well, actually, you could call him Antichrist because he is Helios. He is the embodiment of that belief system. So I guess it is appropriate, but he's basically the Anti-Messiah. Then we have the celestial alignments. Very exciting to talk about those. We will talk about the 2 births probably at that time. Then you have the tribulation. Then you have the second coming. Then there's another 1,000 years of what's called the millennium. Satan is released again. Hashatan, Gadriel is released again with at the Gog-Magog war number 2. Then is Judgment Day and the eighth day. And what I always found interesting about this, whenever I started to follow the way and started to really study the scripture, and not that I never really studied the scripture, but that I really started to have the Father open my eyes to my ears and my heart also to the Hebrew, to the original language. Something that really stood out to me. I mean, you never hear in the Christian belief that you may hear the Gog Magog war, but you don't hear it referred that way. It's always Armageddon. You never hear about, you always hear about Judgment Day, but you never hear about the eighth day, which I always thought was strange. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I believe it's a mentality that's kind of permeated the Christian church. But so something to note about the anti-Messiah, though, because what you'll notice is there's key anchor points in both of these stories, if you will, or both of these narratives. I don't want to say story because story is, well, I guess to be fiction or nonfiction, so it could be true. But so both of these narratives, right? Both of these ways of trying to understand the scripture. So what you're going to see is that the anti-Messiah or Antichrist is kind of the anchor point for both of these narratives. Mid-tribbers, anchor point of the Antichrist coming, they're gone. Prior to that, the pre-tribbers, they're gone. Or, in our case, we're going to use the anti-Messiah as kind of a midway point, or just an anchor point, basically, to talk about the trumpet, the seventh trumpet, and the rapture itself, and maybe where it sits. So something about the anti-Messiah, though, leading up to these events, and we just want to have a full understanding, a better understanding, is that we want to have a better understanding of what's called the Roman Empire. So there's a difference between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, they are not the same to begin with. The Roman Empire existed during the time of Mashiach. Many call Christ. So that period is often referred to as the time of Christ, and ceased to exist around 300 AD. That's the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was founded in 800 AD. We talked about that with Pope Leo III, crowned by Charlemagne and proclaimed him to be the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne was also known as Charles the Great and became the Pope's official protector. What is not always pointed out is that the Holy Roman Empire has risen and fallen several times in history. And that's why I think it's made it difficult to pinpoint on the surface, with surface knowledge almost. And I know that there's theologians that have deep dived in, they're all in with this, belief of Holy Roman Empire rising again. So, but what I think that's done, right, is it's because it's risen and fallen multiple times, it's created confusion. But really, it doesn't have to be confusion, right? It's usually centered around a key coalition, including Germany and Italy. And we saw that when Charlemagne ruled the Franks. So that was kind of the model that was set up for us. But the key model being Germany, it being basically that anchor point for the events surrounding this anti-Messiah kingdom that's being set up. What most don't speak about is that the reason for the formation was that the Pope desired to extend his influence over the entire known world and even the entire earth, but the Pope himself did not have the power or influence to fulfill this dream by himself. And I talked about this in the last episode and probably got some raised eyebrows, that the Pope wanted to, it sounded like I was saying that the Pope wanted to conquer the United States, bring the Catholic and Christian believers underneath his domain and dominion. And that's his desire, and that desire, that's always been his desire. He's always wanted to extend his influence over the entire world. He's always wanted to fulfill that dream. He's never had the power to do it. So instead, what happened was the Pope created a sharing agreement between himself and the emperor, in this case Charlemagne, and to share the influence in order to establish the world dominating empire, which they both sought out. This is known as the Holy Roman Empire. So what's important to note here is that the Holy Roman Empire has always been ruled by two men. So whenever they say that the Antichrist will show up and there'll be a false prophet, and some teach that the false prophet is the second beast of Revelation. We don't teach that. So there are similarities, there are comparisons, but I'm not going to get into that. So what's important to note here is the Holy Roman Empire was always ruled by two men. So there's a political leader and a spiritual leader, or you could say a political leader and a religious leader. And that's what the model that you're going to see to the end. So the last world government will be ruled by two men, known as the anti-Messiah and the false prophet. We say false prophet. It's more of a false religion, you know. And there's lots of things that this can be. So we see that in Revelation 19 and 19 and 20. Now, additionally, in Revelation 17:12, we see that the last human government to rule upon the earth will be the union of 10 kings. So that's the 10 horns or 10 toes. And they will rule just prior to the establishment of the kingdom of Yahweh Elohim on the earth. Now, this is the reason we believe this 10-nation kingdom will come from either the European Union or a recreated Soviet Union, as both were once part of the Holy Roman Empire. And that's who you want to look for. If you're looking for the Antichrist, if that's your thing, you need to look at the European Union or the Soviet Union, a recreated Soviet Union. Okay. Some leader and some political and some religious leader that are working together to bring about this one world government. Now consider for a moment that the Roman Catholic Church is so ingrained in the European Union culture that it has representatives at all the high-level EU meetings. So if you didn't know that, now you do. Add to this that many of the countries making up the EU membership are predominantly Roman Catholic. Okay, so when we say Roman Catholic, of course, and that's why we could say the recreated Soviet Union, because it's Orthodox, Orthodox Roman Catholic, right? So just in case you think we are crazy about a recreated Soviet state, consider that Pope John Paul II, now this is a direct quote from John Paul II, himself suggested that, quote, all of Europe, including the states of the former Soviet Union, should be invited, and that Mikhail Gorbachev would be the ideal president for such a union. Okay, so that should make your head explode. This means that the Roman Catholic Church will have become so powerful by the time Messiah is coming. Now, when we say Roman Catholic Church, this entity, this anti-Messiah entity, this anti-Messiah kingdom being set up by these two rulers, it will have become so powerful by the time of Messiah's coming that her influence will have spread over the entire world. We argue this has already occurred and is the anti-Messiah spirit in the earth, at work, deceiving believer and non-believer alike to violate Yahweh's loving commands to his people. Now, we've spent a lot of time on this, on that one subject. So we're not saying that the Antichrist is already here. We weren't saying that the Pope was the Antichrist. We weren't saying that the any of the popes. I mean, we actually did the opposite. I showed you there's 200 of them. Like, which one could have been the Antichrist, right? what we're saying is the Antichrist kingdom was set up at that time, and it has paved the way. And I'm going to show you just exactly how it's paved the way using the blueprint that the Father's given us to get to where we are today with the United Nations, the European Union, everything that's in place to basically form that one world governmental system. So where does this final 7-year theology come from? Well, many will teach it's found in Daniel 9:27. It says, he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. Daniel 9:27. So if we want to look at that in the Blue Letter Bible website, we can. Hebrew Names Version, he will make a covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, so that's the middle of the 3.5-year period. Again, 1 week is a 7-year period in this case. He shall cause a sacrifice and offering to cease, and on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, and even to the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out on the desolate. Don't try to wrap your head around that last statement. I'll give you a different version that makes more sense. That one's hard to follow. But if we look at what that says, yes, it does reference the week, the final 7-year period. It does reference the Antichrist in that final 7-year period, but it doesn't talk anything about Yahuwah's wrath or his judgment, the tribulation, the trumpets, the seals, the bowls, none of that. So where are we getting the 7-year theology from? So, and I'm asking this question wholeheartedly to all believers, Christian, followers of the way, Messianic believers. I'm asking this question wholeheartedly, right? Because if in the back of your mind you have this like escapist mentality, like the rapture's coming and it's just everybody else's problem, I'm not worried about it, you're never going to change the world. In fact, it's probably the reason that all of this happens is because we don't stand up. And it's because of this mentality. So I'll get off my soapbox, but if we look at other key attributes of the anti-Messiah, and I just shared this if you wanted to go back and look at it, because there's a couple attributes here that I really wanted to hit that are never talked about. So I can go through them really quickly. The anti-Messiah is a man. So 100% the anti-Messiah, Antichrist is a man. Daniel 7:24 and 25. Okay? No question about that. The anti-Messiah will make war with believers for 3.5 years. That's interesting. 3.5 years would allude to a final period of years, like in this case, a 7-year period, and would fit nice into that narrative. But couldn't that 3.5 years be 3,500 years? Think about it. The anti-Messiah would make war with believers for 3,500 years. Has the anti-Messiah kingdom been making war with believers for 3,500 years? I think so. We could certainly go through history and show it. I mean, believers have been persecuted from the time of the beginning. So think about it. The anti-Messiah will make war with believers until the Messiah comes. Okay, we'll talk more about that. That's Daniel 7:21 and 22. You can look these verses up. I'm not going to look them up. I don't have time. But I did want to share them with you so you can have them. The anti-Messiah will confirm a covenant of peace for 7 years. Daniel 9:27. Now we haven't talked about this, and I probably need to go back and do this. Will he strengthen the Jerusalem covenant? Because here's another teaching in the body of believers that I don't fully agree with. They're all teaching that he's going to sign a new covenant. That's not what the scripture says. The scripture says that he will confirm. When it says confirm, the original language they're saying he will strengthen. He will strengthen, meaning that there's already a covenant in place. Most likely, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm just speculating, there's several agreements, peace agreements that have been put in place, but only one very specifically the Jerusalem covenant, declares that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the nation of Israel and must never be surrendered. That's the only thing that Israel would ever agree to. They're not going to give up, their most, to them, sacred um, uh, uh, either land or monument, or in this case, the Temple Mount. Uh, it's ridiculous. Even the scripture says that the Gentiles will only get the outer court. Like they're not gonna agree. They're not gonna agree to give up their most sacred. Hate that word, but their most cherished um, uh, land, as well as the Kodesh Temple, where the Temple Mount, where the third temple is going to be built. Another thing that you should be looking for, because everything's in place to build it. They just need the agreement to build the temple, so that they can build it in peace without the Arabs, Muslims, completely rioting on them. So the anti-Messiah will rise among a union of 10 kings. We've talked about this. These kings give power to the anti-Messiah to dominate. How will he dominate? Will he dominate the entire earth? We're going to look at that. The anti-Messiah will uproot 3 kings. Anti-Messiah will, by peace, will destroy many. I think that's a very interesting statement. Daniel 8:25. If you've never seen that. Through his policy, he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and in their security shall he destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. So through peace, he will destroy many. So sounds a lot like the Catholic Church to me, especially the Dark Ages. The anti-Messiah will have power, lose power, and then regain power and be preceded by 7 kings, and he will be the 8th king. Revelation 17:8, and then 10 through 11. Now, the anti-Messiah will have a fierce or strong countenance and have wisdom, Daniel 7:8. And in verse 20, the anti-Messiah will claim to be Elohim, or God, for 3.5 years into the tribulation, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. But further, the scripture says that the anti-Messiah will have a false prophet and miracles to support him, Revelation 13:12. The anti-Messiah will make war with the anti-Messiah will make war with and persecute believers and saints. The anti-Messiah will honor or worship the God of forces. This one's interesting. It could be, I didn't want to say God of war. It says God of forces in the scripture. But basically, it also says he won't worship the God of his ancestors, whatever that means. But he's certainly worship of power and of progress through means of war. So the anti-Messiah will think to change times and laws. We've talked about that, laws of Yahweh. The anti-Messiah will not regard the desire of women. So this could be he's either homosexual or equally he could be against any kind of support of birth, like birth control, be like a birth control dictator like in China or something like that. And then finally, the anti-Messiah name or character will be 666, is what the scripture tells us. Now, when it says name, it's referring to character. I've spent a lot of time breaking down 666 for you, and what that character is. It is, again, the opposite of Yahweh in every way. What makes this prophecy so difficult is not only the clues in these bullet points, but also scriptures rarely talked about or read aloud and discussed about the anti-Messiah. For example, the anti-Messiah will dominate the world, but not with absolute power. He will be resisted. The anti-Messiah will control the armaments of the world. How will he do that? We've talked about this. It has to be through the European Union or the United Nations, some entity. Does that mean that he'll have control over the United States? No, because there are nation states that will fight against him, at least in 4 different wars that we know of. So what these verses indicate is that the Antichrist, unlike many false teachings, will not dominate the entire world. Okay, that's false. If that were true, Israel would not have a place to escape to for protection. What is called from the eagle or the eagle's wings, we believe to be the United States, or some final form of the United States at the time of the end. We see this when the Great Tribulation begins. Israel will be flown to a place where she is protected from the persecution of the anti-Messiah and supported for 3.5 years. Now, the only reason we say is we see it when the tribulation begins, because that's the narrative that's been spoon-fed us. When you take that away, you start to see the scripture in a different light. Revelation 12:14, 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, so that she might be nourished for a time, times and half a time from the face of the serpent. This seems to also better align to Daniel chapter 11, 21 through 45. And it's too long, I'm not going to read it here, but you can go study it. But which tells us that the anti-Messiah will fight at least 4 wars, 2 of them during this final 3.5 year period. And naturally, some power on the earth or nation are fighting against him in these wars to retain control. Now, continuing in traditional Bible prophecy, the way the book of Revelation is traditionally presented would be a timeline that we're following that looks like this. The seals, the 7, and I talked about this, the 7 seals of the long version of the story ending at the Battle of Armageddon. The trumpets are the shorter story ending at the Battle of Armageddon, and the bowls or the vials, depending on which one you pick, or your scripture, talks about. They're the same, in at the Battle of Armageddon as well, but even are a shorter version than the seals and trumpets. So, further to the way this is taught is that the first bowl, the vial, is unleashed after the mark of the beast. But this seems to contradict that the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls are being the same, or are the same, since the first bowl is unleashed on those who take the mark of the beast. See how if you start to create a doctrine, you have to fit everything into it. So it's from this view that theologians assume from this that the seals, trumpets, and bowls are enacted at the final 7-year period. The challenge with all this is that if the book of Revelation is not in some chronological order, then theologians insist that chapters like Revelation 12, which is the war in heaven, and Revelation 13, describing the one world religion and government, are in fact parenthetical. And I had to look up parenthetical. But parenthetical basically means that anything that does not fit the common narrative is considered relating to or inserted, or is an addition. So it's an addition in thought or placement. It's almost an afterthought, if you will, like, hey, that doesn't really fit into what we're reading, so let's set it aside and shoehorn it in to make it work in the narrative. That's where we get doctrines and theology, right? So this is why most Christians read Revelation as either a fascinating, unreal story that happens in the future, or a sensational group of stories that are not meant to be understood, whether literal or not. And that's really not, that's just it, right? They're not sure if it's even literal or not. Is it locusts or helicopters? Like, nobody knows, right? It's also the reason why most Christians can't agree on when the rapture occurs, pre, mid, or post-trib. It's why Christianity will never change the world, in my view, as all Christians have an escapist mentality that the problems of the world are someone else's, since I'm going away in the rapture anyway. So they are still sitting around waiting for the Antichrist to be revealed so they can go home. It's just a fact. How many Christians do you see protesting in New York with Israel and against the Arabs and the protesters? You know, it's just a fact. Christians are lazy. Some are fighting, but there's no will to fight because you're leaving. Like, you're just going to leave it all behind. So your will's been broken. The enemy has basically tricked you. Whether the rapture happens at when you think it does or not, the enemy has still broken your will because you have this escapist mentality. I'm asking you to kind of wake up a little bit. So that said, we showed you in Revelation 1:1 the message and vision is given to those by Elohim to show his servants the things which must happen soon. So don't tell me you can't understand Revelation 1:1 or the book of Revelation, because this is the revelation of Yeshua HaMashiach, which Elohim gave Yeshua to show to his servants the things which must happen soon. Who were his servants? Us. Now we're going to break down the trumpets as we have done previously in the study with a word study. Okay, we're going to do it step by step. We'll compare the events, share it historically on the earth if there's a match. So the first trumpet, Revelation chapter 8, verse 7. The first trumpet sounded, and there followed hail and fire, mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And 1/3 of the earth was burnt up, and 1/3 of the trees were burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. Now, prior to this is the seals, the 7 seals. We only talked about the first 4. I'll have to go back and probably break down 5, 6, and 7 if we can. But we talked about the first 4 because in the timeline they lead directly into the 7 trumpets. The first 4, I think, are easy to understand. The last 3 of the seals are difficult to understand. The trumpets, in my view, I think once revealed in a certain way, are very easy to understand. So the first trumpet, let's get into it. It says, I read that. So if the blueprint, and I do say if, like in quotes, right? So I don't know everything. If the blueprint that the Father has shared with us, if it holds up, we should see events surrounding the nations we have been studying about. Those nations are the United States, Great Britain, Germany, and Russia. Along with that would be some of the EU states that we've talked about, the 10-nation union that was formed by the EU. It's not 10 nations anymore, but originally it was 10 nations, in alignment to the next stages of the end time timeline. Now picture for a moment that you live in the late 1800s, not 1900s, 1800s. And it's the early 1900s. So late 1800s, early 1900s. So basically, turn of the 20th century, humanity had never seen a destructive event that would match, let's just say, for the sake of argument, the language of the first trumpet, where it would appear there is mass destruction, death, millions of fatalities, that would occur as a result, much less any catastrophe, war, famine, disease. Well, maybe not disease because you had the Black Plague. I'm trying to remember when the Black Plague was. But up until that point, there's very few things that occurred. Sorry, I just had a thought. There are very few things that occurred that would have kind of led you to believe were some kind of biblical event. Let me say it that way. But in 1914, the world was thrust into what was called the Great War. We know it as World War I, or the First World War. Why was it called the First World War? Well, in 6,000 years, there hadn't been a conflict like this. In the First World War, this was a global conflict between two coalitions. They called it the Central Powers. Central Powers being Germany, Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and they were against the Allies, mainly France, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, Japan, and the United States. So fighting took place mainly in Europe and the Middle East, as well as in parts of Africa and the Asian Pacific or Asia Pacific, and in Europe, and it was characterized by trench warfare. Now, what's interesting about this is this war introduced all kinds of new weapons of war, unseen before in history, that led to over 9 million dead. There was another 23 million wounded, with the use of what was called new artillery. There were new machine guns, and then we had chemical weapons and gas. One of the deadliest, it was literally one of the deadliest conflicts in history up until that point. Now, we add to this, there was 8 million civilian deaths from causes including genocide. And of course, the movement of large people was a major factor in the Spanish flu pandemic. It killed millions. So the facts about this war is that it has absolute similar characteristics to the way the scripture talks about the first trumpet and the way that it's described. So let's pause for a minute. Does the Great War start around the time of the Black Horse? Remember, the Black Horse is capitalism. And the answer is yes. So if you follow the seals, the fourth seal is the Black Horse. While we shared capitalism again to spread, the third seal is the Black Horse, the fourth seal is death. And the thought I had is when did the Black Death plague occur? I have to go look that up. But apparently there are some plagues in there between the third, fourth, and the first trumpet. The third, fourth seal and the first trumpet that were starting to unfold. Now, we shared in the last video that capitalism began to be spread worldwide in 1930s, and that's where we put it on the plot line, on our timeline. But we know from historical writings that Karl Marx was writing negatively about capitalism, that's the Black Horse Revelation, in the mid-1800s. You know, one event was in 1867, where he published the Marxist Das Kapital. So we know that capitalism, and I talked about this too in that video, capitalism was around 1850, I think is when it started. We just put it on 1930s because that's when it was accepted worldwide. So here we are, 1850 to 1930, surely following directly after in our timeline, the third and fourth seal, leading to this first trumpet. So they fit historically and chronologically. So do we see the players of Daniel's vision? Again, let's go back to the blueprint. Do we see the players of Daniel's vision in Revelation? Yes. United States, Great Britain, Germany, and Russia all fight and were key participants in the Great War, World War I. Now, in World War I, and there was a new military doctrine. implemented. It was called the scorched earth policy. I don't say, when I say new, let me say renewed, not new. Certainly many um, military strategists throughout history used the scorched earth policy. It was just, I'm going to show you some photos. I mean, to the effect that scorched earth was used during World War One was unbelievable. So we've all seen the old war movie footage or reenactments of this, where two sides are pitted against each other in massive trenches on each side with complete desolate wasteland of just open ground and barbed wire encampments. I believe that's where no man's land came from, was actually for World War One. You didn't venture out in between those two encampments. So, you've got this vision of these two entrenched militaries in the trenches, quite literally, with barbed wire and machine guns and machine gun nests and artillery and all that, right? So most of the war was fought between France and Germany, and the policy was that as the war went on, whichever side took ground military-wise, they were to literally scorch the earth behind them, so as to not leave any resources for the enemy to advance back onto their position. This meant not only the crops for food, but the natural resources of trees and shrubbery for cover, and yes, all the green grass in the wake. Let's go back to the verse and read the verse with new insight, revelation. It says, "The first trumpet was sounded, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. 1/3 of the earth was burnt up, 1/3 of the trees were burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up." And here it does not take much imagination that John on the island of Patmos in a vision in 300 AD time frame is shown the First World War and all its, forgive the term, hell. Okay, how would John describe the new weapons of war, seeing them for the first time? John had never seen the military artillery, much less the machine gun, much less the rifles that they used, much less the uniforms that they had, or the tanks that they drove in World War One and experimenting on. So he's seeing this for the first time. He's describing it as hell and fire mixed with blood. Think about it. He's seeing all the new weapons of war, hell and fire, millions of men dead, mixed with blood. Now think about it. In 6,000 years of human history, before this war, there had never been recorded a war where even 1 million people died. And in this war, the First World War, 9 million people died in its wake. What did the scripture say? Followed the black horse, the pale horse was death. I mean, think about it. It's a fact that the new artillery was the most devastating weapon of World War I. Some bombardments lasted for days and destroyed landscapes, so much so that many of the battlefields in France and Belgium still show the artillery marks from the artillery fire. And the farmers still regularly dig up shells when they're plowing their fields. Now, as the war progressed, the emphasis came for increasingly heavier weapons, as many field guns did insufficient damage to the heavy fortifications. So when it says a field gun, think of a smaller artillery gun, almost like a cannon, but more modern, shooting across the line. And then think of, oh no, that's not gonna break their encampments, not gonna break their defenses and their fortifications. We need bigger. And some of these guns, they were so big. I mean, you've seen some of them are on especially in World War II. Some of them are on rail cars. They were so big. Um, but at this time, they're brand new. They're everybody is using them, and they are bombarding for days and these encampments. And as the war progressed, it got worse. Okay, the effect on the soldiers was unbelievable. Far more soldiers were killed by artillery than by rifle fire, if you don't know that. In fact, the word shell shock, that's where we get that word shell shock from. It's where soldiers were coming under bombardment and just mentally just shell shocked. And tens of thousands of British soldiers had to be treated for that condition. Hell and fire is what John describes. We read in the Old Testament. Now, John never saw hell and fire. John didn't see Sodom and Gomorrah burned to the ground. He read about it in the Hebrew scriptures the same as we have. He's describing this artillery as hellfire, hell and fire, basically being poured out on the earth. We read in the Old Testament, that's the same thing. Like the hellfire was being rained down from the heavens on the disobedient. But let's dig deeper, because for this even to relate to the chronology and historical events, it would have to pave the way for not only the one world government, but the rise of the greatest superpower to wage war against them all, Germany, we know as the leopard. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Versailles was signed and gave some German territories. Now remember, Germany started the war by assassinating I can't remember if it was a member of the Austrian government or don't quote me on that one, but they started the war. So as a result, they were penalized at the end of the war. So at the Treaty of Versailles, they gave up some of their territory to neighboring countries, placed other German territories under international supervision, where have you heard that before? In addition, Germany was stripped of its overseas colonies. Its military capabilities were severely restricted, and it was required to pay war reparations to the Allied countries. But what is most compelling is the treaty paved the way for the creation of the League of Nations, later to become the United Nations, or the UN, the most anti-Semitic institution to ever come against Israel, with more than half of all its resolutions going against the nation of Israel. So we see Russia, the bear, and Germany, the leopard, at work with the anti-Messiah spirit. And I'm showing you pictures of the artillery bombardment and the massive artillery bombardment. I mean, look at the size of the men compared to the artillery. Right? Looks even bigger than some of the stuff we have today. And here's a view of a city in Belgium, sorry. The city of Ypres in 1930, before it was bombarded during World War I, okay? And then the city after it was bombarded after all the destruction, that's all that's left. Now, we know that these events, while absolutely similar to the first trumpet, they're not enough for us to make a decision one way or the other about the chronology unfolding before us. So let's read on. We really must read on to the second trumpet. See if there's any correlation to the second trumpet and the first trumpet. Keep in mind, we're trying to follow that blueprint that the Father has given us. So if we read in the second trumpet, the second angel sounded, and then something like a great burning mountain was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the sea became blood. 1/3 of the living creatures which were in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. Now these are very specific, implicit instructions that are being given about what's happening. So following that blueprint that was shared with us, was there an event after World War I that would match the characteristics and come chronologically in order shown us in the second trumpet? Again, John, he's living in the 300 AD. He's something like 70 or 80 years old on this island, isolated by himself. He's shown a vision of a great mountain thrown into the sea, and it was on fire or burning. So picture this, that after World War I, it would have seemed that Germany was cut off at the heels and able to raise its war machine. But just a few short years later, in 1939, so from 1914 to 1916, and in 1939, the world was thrust into an even greater World War II. That was the biggest and deadliest war in history, involving more than 30 countries. Now, doesn't it seem logical that if those wars had something to do with Israel, that the Father would have put them in His Word? There was much, I'll say, less warlike events, or I don't know how to say this. There's other events in Scripture that were recorded that were not insignificant, but just in sheer magnitude were less than what we're reading about, right? So if Israel was involved, we've said this through the United States and Great Britain, the descendants of Israel, then wouldn't it make sense that the Father would talk about it in His Word, reveal it? So it's just one of the questions that I ask when I read the Scripture and I see things like this. So 1939, this war starts, and there's over 30 countries involved. That's why it was just unbelievable. World War II was sparked by the 1939 Nazi invasion of Poland. Again, Germany invades Poland. What happens? Great Britain and France respond by declaring war on Germany. Shortly after that, a war between the USSR and Germany began in 1941 with the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So they invade Poland, then they invade the Soviet Union. That was followed by war in the Pacific in 1941, and this is when Japan attacks the U.S. and the naval base Pearl Harbor. And then we have the American, Dutch, and British military installations throughout Asia that are being attacked. World War II then dragged on for 6 years until the Allies defeated the Axis power of Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy in 1945. So again, we see the kingdoms that are prophesied to be in power at the time of Messiah's return involved in the second trumpet: the US, Great Britain, Germany, and Russia. The main combatants were the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allies were France, Great Britain, the United States, oddly enough, the Soviet Union, but they were fighting for their life and existence, and to a lesser extent, China. So, what about the great mountain burning with fire? Well, once Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, America entered the war and began what was called a military island hopping campaign. We began destroying key Japanese installations throughout the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific region, where Japan was islands, right? The Japanese islands. Then in August 1945, hundreds of thousands were killed in fire bombings in Japanese cities. Ultimately, the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and knocked Japan out of the war, then rushed to the aid of France and Great Britain to turn the tide against the Third Reich of Hitler, Germany, to end the war. So here again, John is trying to explain something he's never seen before. No one has seen before. But what we know now is, but what we know now as the atomic bomb, right? He's never seen that. Now in school we learned that there was nuclear bomb testing before World War II, but I don't think people realize how much testing went on. And I have to bring this up because there's other parts of the verses that it's discussing. So in total, we know that there were 2,153 atomic bombs, at least that were declassified, that happened across the globe since testing began in 1945. Now, we're not talking about hydrogen bombs or anything like that. We're talking about the atomic bombs that were tested. They started in kilotons and then they went to megatons. So I have included a link here so you can understand the magnitude of this testing. And I think I'll share just a little bit of this video with you, just so you can kind of see. And I'll talk a little bit, while it's playing. What you can see is that on July 16th, 1945, the first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, was detonated shortly after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, keep in mind, the scripture says a third of the sea. Okay, the third of the sea died. What I want you to pay attention to is where all this testing was occurring in the Pacific and oceans around. So you had open air, underground, and in the water, right? So what you just saw was the first 3 bombs that were dropped: Trinity, Little Boy, and Fat Man. And then it's going to go on and start to show. Now remember, how many bombs are getting dropped? That's 5 so far. And we're in 1946 at this point. See how many just got dropped into the Pacific Ocean? That was 3 in a row. Those are kiloton. Now I could fast forward this. You just saw about 10 more dropped into the ocean, and we're only at 24. And I just told you there's over 2,000. And this video that I linked, that I showed you, it maps it all out. You can see just how many bombs got dropped and where they got dropped. And you'll see just how many bombs got dropped in the ocean. It's an important point. Okay. Now, going back to John describing a mountain burning with fire, this is the actual image, or an actual image, one of the actual images of the bomb that went off over Hiroshima, Japan. He said a great mountain burning with fire. This is black and white. This is black and white. Now, even in black and white, it looks like a great mountain. Now, picture if this is in color. If this is in color, and this is an actual image of a bomb being dropped in color, a live snip, right, of a bomb being dropped. Imagine this is more like what John would have seen in his image. He didn't see in black and white. We don't see in black and white. That doesn't make any sense. He would have seen this great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea. Doesn't it make sense that that's what it's talking about? Now, scripture has moved from the realm of story to plausible realism. How would you describe the above image if you did not know what it was? A mountain burning with fire, perhaps? But the description goes on that a third of the fish of the sea were destroyed. Now, it's hard to be certain on the facts of this, and that means only Yahweh could measure the impact of all this atomic bomb testing on the sea life. But the facts are that the atomic bomb tests conducted by the military all over the world in the late 1940s had to have resulted in significant marine life casualties. Had to have, including fish. right? Millions of fish were killed in just 1 kiloton explosion. Millions of fish that they could measure. I mean, um, getting a little long in this one, but I mean, think about what we're saying. Um, think about all the undersea mines, just the undersea mines themselves that were used in this war. Just them going off would have sent hundreds of thousands of fish that were dead floating to the surface. That wasn't even an atomic bomb. And I just showed you there was over 2,000 bombs that went off. I was trying to find the exact number of how many went off in the ocean and in the different oceans across the world. I don't know that number, but um, it probably wouldn't have taken too much to be able to plausibly, realistically associate a third of the living sea life dead as a result of this testing over this few short period of years. So, what else does that scripture say? 1/3 of the sea became blood, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. We discussed how in 6,000 years of human history, it was not recorded that even 1 million men died in war up to World War One, and how almost 9 million died in the Great War. Then along comes World War II, and we know factually and historically approximately 52 million died in World War II. So we went from approximately 9 million, it's like 8.5 million, to 52 million people dead in World War II, right after death is released in the fourth seal. Now, scripture says that a third of the ships were destroyed. And while there are numerous sources on this, CIA, fact book, records for us that we can look at, there is verifiable proof on this one that approximately 1/3 of the ships were destroyed during this World War One. This means that World War Two, and this means that all the blood of the men, along with them in the sea from the sea warfare, right, the ships, the submarines, all that stuff, were destroyed. There were 105,127 ships that were participating in World War II. 36,387 ships were destroyed at the end of the war, approximately 1/3. And I share the link with you so you can go look at the interactive map. So if by now your mind is blown, it's okay. The first time the Father showed me this through, and I had to give credit to Irvin Baxter and his ministry. I do think he got this right. It just clicked in my brain, right, in spirit, and has continued to be an anchor point to understanding Revelation. But now, if you are a Christian and you follow mainstream Revelation doctrine, you are likely asking, why were you taught that all the trumpets of Revelation would exist in a final 7-year period? Now, remember what I said at the beginning of the study? A day could be 1,000 years. A 7-year period could be extended to a longer period. The way the Father defines his time frames, right? So what you have to ask yourself is the doctrine of the final 7-year period where all this is happening, where is that in Scripture? Because if what's being shared here is truth, what does it mean for the rapture? Or even your most basic understanding of the end time? Now, going back to my question earlier, where does this idea or theology come from that Revelation is unfolded all in a final 7-year period? And the truth be told, it's not found in Scripture. It's a theory that's become a man's doctrine, and when embraced blinded us all to the truth. So let's say that you're not convinced that World War I is the first trumpet. You're not convinced that World War II is the second trumpet. I'll go through the third, fourth, and fifth trumpet. We'll continue to look at it. But here's the bottom line. The sixth trumpet is the one that we want to study the most, because it says the third part of mankind dies. The third, fourth, and fifth trumpet have already been sounded. We're going to take you through that in the next video. And thank you for all your prayers, and praise Yahweh. It's going to get good. So hang in there.